Okay, so in the last video, we got through sources and filters and the ways that the two interact to produce some kind of an output. In this one, we'll talk I'll give a quick summary again of how the entire system works and why we're studying it, and then I'll talk a little more about vowels as being essentially filters. Okay, so we get the source, we push it through a filter, we get an output. And the output from your lips is going to be a pressure wave. It's going to be fluctuations in air pressure that are coming from your lips and radiating out into the air around you. Pressure at your lips will push air particles that are nearby your lips. That's going to make them move, which in turn will heighten the pressure in front of them and push the particles in front of them, and on and on and on and on. This is what it means to say that a wave propagates. Uh, Eventually, this is going to spread out in all directions, and if there happens to be an ear or a microphone nearby, some particles will push into the ear and raise the pressure in there. Now, your ear is a phenomenally interesting and intricate and perfect physical system. I won't go into too much detail about this, and it's not something you need to know for this class. I just think it's really, really cool. So how does this work? Eventually, after the wave propagates, some particles are going to push into your ear. They're going to, well, I said hit a membrane just inside, which is actually not quite right. There's actually three tiny, perfectly balanced bones inside your ear, and the air pressure is going to hit a membrane that moves these little bones, and it's going to make those little tiny bones tap on another membrane. So you have like these three perfectly tiny balanced little bones tapping on a membrane that has some fluid behind it. When these little hammer bones tap on the membrane with the fluid behind it, the fluid starts vibrating or swirling around and moving in particular ways that are preserving the fluctuations in air pressure and propagating it into the fluid inside your ear. And that moves some little tiny hairs that are sitting on a nerve inside your ear. Uh, each hair has a particular resonant frequency. These are referred to as cilia, these hairs, and they only vibrate at some frequencies. So if the wave that's propagated into your inner ear, into the fluid, is has energy at that frequency, it will activate the cilia at that particular frequency, and that movement will generate some electricity inside the nerve in your ear, and then it's going to be attached to a nerve cell, which is attached to other nerve cells all the way into your brain. This is how you hear. It's this incredible chain of very intricate, complex events that took billions of years to evolve, arguably. And this is something that all mammals basically share. Not every other group of animals hears in exactly the same way, but mammals mostly hear like this. And this took an extremely long time to evolve. It is a beautiful system. That said, we're not going to really study this in this class. I just think it's neat. So, this is how the output works. It eventually gets outside your face and hits somebody's ear if you're lucky, and then it gets into their brain so that they hear it as a sound. Right? Why are we covering all of this source filter stuff to begin with? Again, I've told you that I don't need you to be able to recite to me every detail of how this speech process works or the mathematics of waves or anything like that. But I do want you to understand that source properties come from one articulator, from your glottis, and they affect some aspects of phonetics and phonology. Filter properties come from a different part of your vocal tract, from the supralaryngeal articulators, and they affect different aspects of phonetics and phonology from source properties. And the two can be manipulated independently. Right? This is the sort of part that's a little bit hard to get your head around. We can change the source properties of our glottis while keeping the exact same filter, and we can change the filter properties of our supralaryngeal articulators while keeping the exact same source, the exact same glottal vibration. So that means that there's going to be many different dimensions along which speech sounds can differ from one another, right? And these are going to be independent dimensions. So most of the stuff we're going to study this semester has to do with filters. In particular, pretty much everything about vowels, at least everything that's relevant to this semester, is a filter property. Vowel height, vowel backness, vowel roundness, these are all properties of your filter system. Similarly, for consonant place, it's going to depend on where your supralaryngeal articulators are, also a filter property. For consonant manner, it's going to depend on basically how open or closed your vocal tract is above the glottis. So that's going to be also a filter property. So almost all the features we're looking at this semester are going to be filter properties, and they're going to be more or less independent of the main source property that we're looking at this semester, which is voicing and aspiration, which we'll talk about at least to some extent this semester. And this is basically for voicing, it's a source property. Is the hose on or is the hose off? Right? That's basically what's going on here. Other things like pitch, which is, again, our perception of a sound being low or high. That's going to be a source property, but we won't spend too much time on it this semester. And tone, which is the use of pitch distinctions to convey lexical contrast, doesn't happen in English or Spanish or French, but it happens in many, many other languages. That's also going to be a source property. We're going to study pitch and tone in detail next semester in the advanced phonology class for those of you who take it, but we're not going to go into so much detail this semester about pitch and tone. There are other source properties that are important to phonetics and to phonology, at least in some languages, that we're basically going to skip this semester. And this includes things such as voice quality, breathy voice, creaky voice, modal voice, as well as spectral balance, which has to do with probably stress and prosodic categories. We're not going to spend much time on these this semester just because we can only do so much and it gets pretty complicated. So for now, let me tell you a little bit about how vowels are filters, right? Or as I've put it here, how do filter properties define different vowels? So we saw above that when we cross or multiply a source and a filter, we're going to get an output spectrum. This is idealized. It's kind of like the one in this illustration up here. This is not a real sound. It's just a diagram that tries to make it clear what's happening. And this is going to reflect both the spacing of the source spectrum, that is the F0 and the harmonics, the general declining shape of that source spectrum, but also the filter properties. So it looks like there's a little peak in the filter here and a trough here and another peak here. And these peaks we refer to as formants. And to a first approximation, a vowel is simply a collection of formants. That is a way of thinking about what different vowels are. They are different bundles of formants. So here is an idealized one with straight vertical lines, one nice discrete line for each harmonic. Now, when we're actually measuring sounds in the real world, nothing is ever this perfect and nice. In order to get straight vertical lines in an actual sound recording, you would need to have somebody saying a vowel for an infinite amount of time. And so that's not practical. Instead, what we get out of real sounds is this slightly messier spectrum. And so this is taken from, this might be a schwa vowel. Oh no, I think this is an a vowel. And this is actually showing you what acoustic software can recover from the records of air pressure brought to a computer by a microphone. And what you can see here is that there's no nice vertical lines, but you do get these pretty clear little fingers sticking up. You know, every so many hertz, you get another one. These are individual harmonics. And this is what they look like in a real speech sound, not in this sort of idealized version. And you can even see in here that we're getting some pretty clear peaks. So here's a peak, here's a peak, here's a peak, here's a peak. So these are going to be formants in real speech. So, again, summarizing, recapping. The shape of the spectrum depends on the resonances. Resonant, resonant, resonant. The resonances depend on the shape of the vocal tract. The shape of the vocal tract depends on the positions of the supralaryngeal articulators. The resonances inside a vowel, in particular, are referred to as formants. And so the peaks in a vowel spectrum are that vowel's formants. Our perception of vowel quality, height, backness, rounding, depends mostly on the first three formants and really mostly on the first two. But I'll show three in these diagrams just for completeness sake. So here is a recording of the vowel a, the low front unrounded vowel of English, of American English. And you can see there's a first peak here. This is the first formant, or F1. A second peak here. This is the second formant, or F2. And a third peak here. This is the third formant, or F3. Now, you could also recover, at least to roughly from the spectrum, you'd also be able to figure out the fundamental frequency, or F0, of this vowel. But this is a fundamentally different kind of property. In order to get the F0, you'd need to measure how much space, how much frequency is in between each little finger and the next little finger, because these are the individual harmonics. So that's going to be very different than formants, which are a filter property and just correspond to locating the peaks in the overall spectrum. Here is a power spectrum of a recording of the vowel I, the high front unrounded lax vowel of American English. You can see there's a first formant, a second formant, and a third formant, F1, F2, F3. And the only observation here is that these vowels have different features, right? They're both front, but this one's low, this one's high, and so on and so forth. And correspondingly, they have different formant frequencies. It looks like this one has a lower F1, this one has a higher F1. And it's a little bit hard to tell with the F2 and the F3. We'd have to make a different kind of comparison to be sure. But the point is just that they have different sets of formants. Maybe their F2 and F3 are exactly the same, but their F1's different. Maybe their F1 and F2 are the same, but their F3's different. Maybe all three of the formants are different. But there's going to be some spectral differences that define what the difference between an A and an I actually is in physical terms. Now these spectra that we're looking at, the plural of spectrum is spectra, they only show the distribution of energy at a particular point in time. Right? So this is like looking at 100 milliseconds of an A vowel, saying within that particular time period, what's going on with the distribution of energy at different frequencies. This is sort of one moment or one stretch of time. If we're going to want to look at more than one sound in a row, or at how sounds change as they're being pronounced, which we do, we're going to need a way of showing how these spectra change over time. So here's a basic idea. This is going to be one of the more important visual displays that we'll use in this class. We could take a bunch of these spectra at different points in time and stack them next to each other. That's what this fancy three-dimensional graphic is showing you. This is not what we're going to end up using exactly, but imagine that we basically have a bunch of those spectra as like mountains, and we're putting them next to each other so that it's showing us, hey, at the beginning, we really just have a flat spectrum. So across all these different frequencies, there's no real height. But then as we keep going, here's a formant that pops up. There's like a little mountain peak that pops up, and then it disappears. And then at this other moment in time, we get two more little mountain peaks here at different frequencies, and then those persist for a while throughout time. This is one way to visualize how spectra change over time, but it's a little bit involved, and producing them and reading them would be pretty hard. And so we've developed a more compact way of doing this that works in 2 dimensions instead of 3. And this is a spectrogram. Right? So this is one of the more basic representations of speech sounds that we're going to be working with this semester. And here is what's going on here. What we've done is take a bunch of individual spectra, right? And so this is just showing you at any given moment in time, right? Time is going from the left to the right here. And I've pulled out 3 spectra from 3 different moments in this vowel. And it's just showing you that each sort of vertical slice here is its own spectrum, just like the spectra we looked at earlier. And it's color coded in this very particular way, so that frequencies with a lot of energy get dark, and frequencies with less energy are lighter, right? So if you look at this particular vertical slice, you'll see that there's a dark portion down here at a low frequency. So frequency is on the vertical axis here. And so that's corresponding to this very dark low peak. And then there's like a sort of lightening, that's probably this trough. And then there's another dark peak, and that's going to be this one. It's not quite as dark as the first one, but it's still pretty dark. I haven't shown you the color coding with these other two. I just did this for the first. These other two are just showing you that, hey, if you look at different points in time, you'll find slightly different spectra throughout the course of the vowel. So what's going on in these representations? Well, these dark bands each correspond to a spectral peak, that is a formant. So if they're persisting over the course of a vowel over time, they're going to show up as dark horizontal bands. This is what formants look like in a spectrogram, and it's the best way to discover the formants of a particular sound is to look at a spectrogram of the sound. I'm going to cover how to do this in Prot in one of the other videos. So in this particular sound, I see 4 formants here, and it might be a little bit tricky to see just looking at these, but if you get a little bit of practice with them, you'll probably be able to do this too. I see 1 formant here. I see a second formant, F2, over here, so F1, F2, and then I see F3 and F4. And it's not clear to me this top one here, that might be 2 formants. It's a little bit hard to tell. Once you get higher into the frequency range, the formants become much less clear in most speech, which is okay because we're usually only really interested in 2 or 3 of them to begin with. All right, so what if we went out and did this for a whole bunch of different vowels and just looked at their formant values? Well, here is Peter Ladefoged's vowels. He is a famous British phonetician who's sort of the father of linguistic phonetics. And this is him saying a bunch of cardinal vowels: E, I, A, U, and U. And these black arrows have been added to the spectrograms. They're just marking roughly where the formants are. And so some of the things to notice here, these are all front vowels, and these are all back vowels. And one thing that distinguishes the entire top row here from the entire bottom row here is the second formant, or F2 frequency, which is way higher for these front vowels, around 2000 hertz in most of them, and way lower for these back vowels, around 1000 hertz for most of them. You can also see that some of these have rising F2 trajectories. That's probably because of consonants. So let's ignore that for the moment. We're just going to look at the beginnings of the vowels. And these have much lower F2 for back vowels than for front vowels. That's not an accident. A little bit harder to see here because of the scale on the vertical axis is the changes in F1. But if we go from high through a little bit less high, through mid, through low, you might be able to see here that the first formant is rising. F1 goes up. And then we go the opposite direction, from low vowels over here to mid to almost high to high. Here, the first formant, F1, is going down. So this is, again, not an accident. The main correlates of vowel height and backness across languages are the F1 and F2 frequencies. If we were going to make a plot of all of these spectrograms based on their F1 and their F2, it would look like this. So what are we doing here? Well, we start with this U vowel. We ask what's its first formant. It's around 300 hertz. And we're going to plot F1 upside down for reasons I'll explain in a second. And then what's its second formant? It's like 900 hertz or something. So put a dot at 300, 900. There's oo. Now do the same thing for all the other vowels. Here's the shape that you get. Does that look familiar to you? It should. This is basically the vowel quadrilateral from the IPA. F1 is tracking vowel height very, very closely, except backwards. So low F1, high vowels, high F1, low vowels. That's why this is on a reverse scale. F1 has lower values up here, higher values down here, because we're trying to preserve the shape of the IPA chart. Right? So F1 is inversely related to vowel height. Here's F2, back vowels, front vowels. Higher F2, front vowels. Lower F2, back vowels. And indeed, there's lots of evidence that this is a far more reliable way of thinking about how vowels work, even than the articulatory things I told you about a few weeks ago. So really, you can think of vowels as being collections of formants. And really, most of the information we need is in the first two. There's also information in the other formants, but we're going to be mainly focused on these two and a little bit on F3 for the next few weeks. And this is just trying to show you that we can recreate all the properties of vowels based on physically measuring them, right? And that's good because it means we can start to have an idea of how people hear things like back vowel or front vowel or high vowel or low vowel. Okay. The next few videos, I'm going to take apart some sounds in Prot and show you how to look at sounds in the software and also demonstrate some of the things I've just been through.